The morning sun painted the endless prairie grass in shades of gold as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her family's sod house. At 19, she had grown accustomed to the vast emptiness of the Nebraska territory, but today something felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, and even the ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's father, Thomas Mitchell, had left 3 days earlier with a wagon train bound for Fort Laramie, carrying supplies and trade goods. Her mother, Elizabeth, remained bedridden with a fever that had plagued her for weeks. This left Sarah alone to tend to their small homestead, care for their livestock, and nurse her ailing mother back to health. The Mitchell family had arrived in Nebraska 2 years prior, drawn by promises of fertile land and new opportunities. Thomas had claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, and they had worked tirelessly to build their modest home and establish their farm. The sod house, constructed from blocks of prairie earth, provided adequate shelter but little comfort during the harsh winters and scorching summers. As Sarah fed their chickens and milked their lone cow, she noticed the sky taking on an unusual hue. What had begun as a clear blue morning was gradually becoming hazy, with a yellowish tint that made the sun appear dimmer than usual. She paused in her work, shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. In the distance, she could see a dark line that seemed to shimmer and dance. Her heart began to race as recognition dawned. She had heard stories from other settlers about prairie fires, massive walls of flame that could travel faster than a horse and consume everything in their path. The veterans of the plains spoke of these fires with a mixture of fear and respect, describing how they could appear suddenly and spread with terrifying speed across the dry grasslands. Sarah dropped her milk pail and ran toward the house, her long skirt catching on the tall grass as she stumbled in her haste. She burst through the door, finding her mother propped up in bed, her face flushed with fever but her eyes alert. "Mother, there's a fire coming," Sarah gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "We need to leave immediately." Elizabeth Mitchell tried to rise but fell back against her pillow, weakness overwhelming her. "I can't travel, Sarah. You must go without me." "I won't leave you," Sarah declared firmly, moving to help her mother sit up. "We'll find a way." The smell of smoke was beginning to seep into their home, and through the small window, Sarah could see that the dark line on the horizon had grown larger and more distinct. Orange flames danced above the prairie grass, creating a wall of fire that stretched as far as the eye could see. The wind, which had been so still earlier, now began to pick up, and Sarah knew it would only feed the approaching inferno. She quickly gathered what supplies she could carry: a water jug, some dried meat, and a heavy woolen blanket. Her hands shook as she tried to think of their options. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even if they could reach help, there wasn't time to return for her mother. "The root cellar," Elizabeth whispered weakly. "It's our only chance." Behind their house, Thomas had dug a small root cellar for storing vegetables through the winter. It was barely large enough for 2 people, but it was underground and might provide protection from the fire above. Sarah helped her mother to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way slowly toward the back of the house. The wind was growing stronger now, and Sarah could hear a low roaring sound in the distance that made her blood run cold. The fire was moving faster than she had anticipated, and the air was becoming thick with smoke. Her eyes began to water, and she could taste the acrid flavor of burning grass on her tongue. They reached the cellar just as the first sparks began to fall around them like deadly snow. Sarah threw open the wooden door and helped lower her mother into the cramped space below. The cellar was dark and musty, filled with the earthy smell of stored potatoes and turnips. Elizabeth collapsed onto the dirt floor, her breathing labored and her skin pale despite her fever. Sarah climbed down and pulled the door shut above them, plunging them into complete darkness. She could hear her mother's ragged breathing beside her and feel the warmth of her fevered body in the confined space. Above them, the roaring sound was growing louder, accompanied by crackling and snapping as the fire devoured everything in its path. The wooden door above them grew hot to the touch, and smoke began to seep through the cracks around its edges. Sarah pressed the woolen blanket against the gaps, trying to keep the deadly fumes from filling their small refuge. Her lungs burned with each breath, and her eyes streamed tears that had nothing to do with emotion. Hours seemed to pass in that underground tomb. The heat above them was intense, and Sarah could hear their chickens squawking in terror before falling silent. The roof of their sod house must have caught fire, and she imagined their modest possessions being consumed by the relentless flames. Everything her family had worked for was being destroyed. But all that mattered now was survival. Elizabeth's breathing became more labored, and Sarah feared that the combination of fever and smoke might claim her mother's life even if they survived the fire. She held her mother's hand in the darkness, whispering words of comfort and hope that she didn't entirely feel herself. The roaring above them reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very earth, and then, gradually, it began to fade. The crackling of flames continued, but the terrible wind-driven sound of the fire's advance was moving away from them. Sarah waited, afraid to hope as the heat above them slowly began to diminish. When she finally pushed open the cellar door, she was met with a scene of utter devastation. The prairie stretched before them like a blackened moonscape, still smoldering and sending up wisps of smoke. Their house was gone, reduced to a pile of charred wood and melted metal. The barn and outbuildings had vanished as if they had never existed. Sarah helped her mother from the cellar, both of them coughing and gasping in the smoky air. They stood together in the ruins of their homestead, surrounded by destruction as far as the eye could see. The fire had passed, but their ordeal was far from over. They were alone on the burned prairie with little water, no shelter, and no way to signal for help as the sun began to set, painting the smoky sky in shades of red and orange that reminded Sarah too much of the fire they had just survived. She realized that their fight for survival had only just begun. The night brought little relief from their desperate situation. Sarah and her mother huddled together in the root cellar, which now served as their only shelter against the cold prairie wind that swept across the burned landscape. Elizabeth's fever had worsened and she drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently as Sarah tried to keep her warm with the single blanket they had salvaged. When dawn broke, Sarah emerged from the cellar to survey their surroundings more carefully. The devastation was complete and heartbreaking. Where once golden grass had waved in endless waves, now only charred stubble and ash remained. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke, and small fires continued to smolder in scattered patches across the blackened earth. Their water supply was critically low. The jug Sarah had grabbed contained barely enough for one day, and with her mother's fever burning through her body, she needed fluids desperately. Sarah knew she had to find water soon, or they would both perish in this wasteland. She helped her mother drink a small sip of their precious water, and then set out to explore the immediate area. Perhaps their well had survived the fire, though she doubted the wooden cover and rope would have escaped the flames. As she picked her way across the hot, ash-covered ground, her boots crunched on the remains of their former life. The well was indeed damaged, its wooden framework reduced to charcoal, but the stone-lined shaft appeared intact. Sarah lowered herself carefully to peer into the depths, hoping to see the glint of water below. Instead, she was met with the sight of debris that had fallen into the well during the fire. Even if water remained at the bottom, it would be contaminated and possibly undrinkable. Despair began to creep into her heart as she realized the full extent of their predicament. They were stranded in the middle of a burned prairie with no food, no clean water, and no means of transportation. Her mother was gravely ill and growing weaker by the hour. The nearest settlement was at least 20 miles away, a distance that would be challenging for a healthy person on foot, let alone someone caring for an invalid. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat began to reflect off the blackened earth with uncomfortable intensity. Sarah returned to the cellar to check on her mother, and found Elizabeth barely responsive. Her lips cracked and dry despite the small amounts of water Sarah had given her. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that filled Sarah with dread. "Mother, please stay with me," Sarah whispered, gently stroking Elizabeth's fevered brow. "Father will return soon and everything will be all right." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they weren't true. Thomas Mitchell wasn't expected back for another week, and even then he might not find them in this transformed landscape. The familiar landmarks that would guide him home had been erased by the fire, leaving only an endless expanse of black desolation. By midday, Sarah made the difficult decision to leave her mother in the cellar, while she ventured further from their homestead in search of water. She left the remaining water with Elizabeth and promised to return before nightfall. Setting out across the burned prairie, Sarah soon discovered that walking on the ash-covered ground was more treacherous than she had anticipated. The earth was still hot in many places, and she could feel the heat through the soles of her boots. Hidden embers occasionally flared to life when disturbed by her passage, sending up small puffs of smoke and forcing her to step carefully around them. The ash was surprisingly deep in some areas, reaching almost to her knees and making each step an effort. As she walked, Sarah began to notice that the fire had not been completely uniform in its destruction. Occasionally, she came across small patches where the flames had burned less intensely, leaving behind twisted metal fragments or partially charred wood. These remnants of other homesteads told the story of families who had faced the same terror she and her mother had endured. The sight of a child's burned doll lying in the ash brought tears to her eyes and reminded her of how fortunate they had been to survive at all. Many others had not been so lucky, and she wondered how many families had perished in the inferno that had swept across the territory. After walking for several hours without finding any source of clean water, Sarah began to feel the effects of dehydration herself. Her mouth was dry, her head ached, and she found it increasingly difficult to focus on her surroundings. The sun beat down mercilessly on the blackened landscape, creating a hellish environment that seemed designed to drain the life from any creature. Foolish enough to venture into it, she was beginning to consider turning back when she spotted something that made her heart leap with hope. In the distance, perhaps half a mile away, she could see what appeared to be a line of green vegetation. Where there was green growth, there was usually water, and water meant survival for both her and her mother. Summoning her remaining strength, Sarah pushed forward through the ash and debris. As she drew closer, her hope proved justified. A small creek had survived the fire, its banks lined with vegetation that had been singed but not destroyed. The water was muddy and filled with ash, but it was flowing, and appeared to be relatively clean beneath the surface debris. Sarah knelt by the creek's edge and cupped her hands to drink deeply, not caring about the gritty taste of ash that coated her tongue. The cool water soothed her parched throat and gave her the strength to think clearly about her next steps. She needed to bring water back to her mother, but she had no container large enough to carry a meaningful amount. Looking around the creek bed, Sarah began to search for anything that might serve as a water vessel. Among the debris that had washed downstream during the fire, she found a partially melted tin bucket that had somehow retained its basic shape. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold water long enough for her to make the journey back to the cellar. As she filled the makeshift container, Sarah's attention was drawn to movement on the far side of the creek. Her heart stopped as she realized she was no longer alone on the burned prairie. A figure on horseback had appeared on the opposite bank, and from the distance she couldn't tell if it was friend or foe. The rider sat motionless for a long moment, clearly observing her. Sarah remained frozen by the creek, unsure whether to run, hide, or call out for help. Stories of Indian raids and hostile encounters flooded her mind, but desperation began to override her fear. Her mother was dying, and this stranger might represent their only chance for survival. Slowly, the rider began to cross the creek, his horse picking its way carefully through the shallow water. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that he was indeed a Native American, his long black hair braided and his clothing a mixture of traditional and traded items. He carried a rifle across his saddle, but his posture didn't suggest immediate threat. The two regarded each other warily as the distance between them closed. Sarah clutched the tin bucket to her chest, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She was completely vulnerable here, miles from any help with no weapon and no means of escape. Her fate and that of her mother now rested in the hands of this stranger, who had emerged from the devastated landscape like a figure from another world. The rider stopped his horse just a few feet away and studied Sarah with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her desperate situation. When he finally spoke, his words were in accented but clear English that surprised her. "You are far from safety, white woman. The fire has left nothing but death behind." Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the water bucket, her eyes fixed on the stranger who had appeared so suddenly in this desolate wasteland. The Native American man dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, his movements suggesting years of life on the prairie. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with strong features and eyes that held a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Please," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice cracking from smoke damage and dehydration. "My mother is dying. She has fever, and we have no shelter, no food." She gestured helplessly toward the direction of their destroyed homestead. "Our house burned. Everything is gone." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her singed dress, her soot-stained face, and the desperate fear in her eyes. When he spoke again, his tone had softened slightly, though he maintained his cautious distance. "I am Red Hawk of the Lakota. I scout for the army sometimes, but today I ride alone." He nodded toward the blackened prairie stretching endlessly around them. "This fire, it came fast and hungry. Many have died. Are you going to help us?" Sarah asked directly, abandoning any pretense of diplomacy. Time was running out for her mother, and she could afford neither pride nor prejudice in this moment of crisis. Red Hawk's expression remained unreadable as he considered her request. The relationship between white settlers and the Lakota had been strained at best, often erupting into violence and mistrust. Many of his people viewed the encroaching homesteaders as invaders who destroyed the natural balance of the prairie. Yet this woman before him was clearly in desperate need, and Lakota tradition held that ignoring someone in mortal danger brought dishonor. "Show me this mother of yours," he said finally, swinging back onto his horse. "We will see what can be done." Relief flooded through Sarah as she led the way back across the burned landscape, the precious water sloshing in her makeshift bucket. Red Hawk rode slowly beside her, his horse stepping carefully through the ash and debris. As they traveled, he explained what he had observed during his journey across the fire-ravaged territory. "The fire started 3 days ago, near the Platte River," he told her. "Lightning struck during the dry season, and the wind carried it fast across the grass. It burned for 2 days and nights before the rain finally stopped it." He paused, studying the devastation around them. "Your family was not the only one caught by surprise." When they reached the root cellar, Sarah climbed down immediately to check on her mother. Elizabeth was unconscious, her breathing so shallow that Sarah had to place her ear close to her mother's lips to detect it. Her fever had worsened, and her skin was hot and dry to the touch. Without immediate intervention, Sarah knew her mother would not survive another day. Red Hawk peered down into the cellar from above, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. He had seen many people suffering from fever and exposure during his years as a scout, and he recognized the signs of someone close to death. "She needs medicine," he said grimly, "and shelter from the heat." He straightened up and gazed across the burned prairie. "There is a place, perhaps half a day's ride from here. My grandmother lives there with others of our people. She has knowledge of healing plants and fever medicine." Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but then reality crashed down upon her. "I can't carry her that far. She's too weak to travel, and I have no horse." Red Hawk was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with a decision that went against years of ingrained caution and tribal loyalty. Finally, he dismounted and began to unsaddle his horse. "We will make a travois," he announced. "The horse can pull her." Sarah watched in amazement as Red Hawk efficiently constructed a simple but effective stretcher, using his saddle blanket and 2 long pieces of charred wood he salvaged from the ruins of their barn. His movements were quick and sure, speaking of extensive experience in wilderness survival and improvisation. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked as they worked together to make Elizabeth as comfortable as possible on the makeshift stretcher. "Your people and mine, we haven't always been friends." Red Hawk paused in securing the blanket around Elizabeth's frail form. "My grandmother teaches that all people are connected by the same sky, the same earth. When the fire burns, it does not ask if you are white or Lakota before it devours your home." He met Sarah's eyes directly. "Today you are not a white settler. You are a daughter trying to save her mother's life." The journey to Red Hawk's village was grueling. Sarah walked alongside the horse while Red Hawk led it carefully across the treacherous terrain. Every few hundred yards they had to stop to adjust Elizabeth's position or clear debris from their path. The older woman remained unconscious throughout most of the trip, occasionally mumbling incoherently or crying out in distress. As they traveled, Red Hawk shared more about himself and his people. He had learned English during his time working as a scout for the U.S. Army, a position that often put him in the uncomfortable position of serving as an intermediary between 2 cultures that frequently misunderstood each other. His grandmother, he explained, was a respected medicine woman who had successfully treated many cases of severe fever and illness, and she will want to know about your mother's sickness, he told Sarah as they navigated around a particularly large area of still smoldering debris. "When did the fever start? Has she eaten anything unusual? Has she been near bad water?" Sarah provided what information she could. describing how her mother's illness had begun several days before the fire with chills and headaches that gradually worsened into the burning fever that now consumed her. She mentioned that they had been drinking from their well, which had always been clean before, and eating the same foods they had consumed for months without incident. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Red Hawk suddenly raised his hand for them to stop. Sarah followed his gaze and saw smoke rising in the distance. But this was different from the smoldering remnants of the fire. This smoke rose straight up in thin, controlled columns that spoke of cooking fires and human habitation. "My grandmother's village," Red Hawk announced with evident relief. "We have made good time." As they approached the settlement, Sarah was struck by how different it was from what she had expected. The village consisted of several traditional teepees, arranged in a loose circle around a central fire pit. But there were also some more permanent structures that appeared to blend native construction techniques with materials acquired through trade with white settlers. Dogs began barking as they approached, alerting the villagers to their arrival. People emerged from their dwellings to watch the unusual procession of a Lakota warrior leading a white woman and an unconscious patient on a travois. Children peered curiously from behind their parents, while the adults maintained expressions of cautious interest. An elderly woman emerged from the largest teepee, her gray hair braided with colored beads and her clothing adorned with intricate beadwork. Despite her advanced age, she moved with purpose and authority as she approached the group. Sarah immediately knew this must be Red Hawk's grandmother, the medicine woman who represented their last hope for saving Elizabeth's life. The old woman spoke rapidly to Red Hawk in Lakota, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the situation. Red Hawk responded in the same language, gesturing towards Sarah and her mother as he explained their circumstances. Sarah watched anxiously as the conversation continued, unable to understand the words but reading the gravity of the situation in both their expressions. Finally, the medicine woman approached the travois and knelt beside Elizabeth. She placed her weathered hands on the unconscious woman's forehead and chest, her fingers probing gently for signs of life and illness. After a thorough examination, she looked up at Sarah and spoke in halting but understandable English. "Your mother walks close to the spirit world, but the path back to life is not yet closed." She stood slowly, her joints creaking with age. "Bring her to my lodge. We will see if the old medicine can call her spirit home." Inside the medicine woman's teepee, Sarah found herself in a world completely foreign to her previous experience. The interior was spacious and warm, with buffalo hides covering the ground and various herbs, roots, and mysterious bundles hanging from the wooden framework. The air was thick with the scent of sage and other plants she couldn't identify, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and otherworldly. The medicine woman, who introduced herself as Winona, worked with practiced efficiency as she prepared a place for Elizabeth. She spoke in low tones to Red Hawk, who translated her instructions for Sarah's benefit. Several other women from the village had arrived to assist, their faces showing curiosity but no hostility toward the white strangers who had suddenly appeared in their midst. "My grandmother says your mother has the burning sickness that sometimes comes after breathing too much fire smoke," Red Hawk explained as they carefully transferred Elizabeth to a pile of soft furs. "She has seen this before during other prairie fires. The smoke gets deep into the body and makes the spirit confused." Winona began preparing various medicinal concoctions, mixing dried herbs with water and brewing teas from plants that Sarah had never seen before. The old woman's movements were deliberate and confident, speaking of decades of experience in healing the sick and injured. She chanted softly as she worked, her voice creating a rhythmic backdrop to her activities. Sarah watched anxiously as Winona applied cool, herb-soaked cloths to her mother's forehead and began trying to get small amounts of medicine down her throat. Elizabeth remained unconscious, but her breathing seemed to steady slightly under the medicine woman's care. For the first time since the fire, Sarah allowed herself to hope that her mother might survive. As the evening progressed, more members of the village stopped by to check on the unusual patients. Sarah was surprised by their kindness and curiosity. Many of them had never seen a white woman up close, and they studied her with the same fascination she felt toward their customs and way of life. The children were particularly bold, creeping close to touch her blonde hair before scurrying away with giggles. Red Hawk served as translator for many of these interactions, helping Sarah understand the questions and comments of the villagers. She learned that this particular band of Lakota had avoided most of the conflicts that plagued relations between whites and Native Americans in other parts of the territory. They maintained a cautious but generally peaceful coexistence with nearby settlements, trading occasionally and avoiding the war parties that sometimes swept through the region. "My grandmother's village has always been neutral," Red Hawk explained as they sat by the fire outside the medicine lodge. "She believes that fighting brings only more fighting, and that wisdom lies in finding ways to live alongside each other, rather than driving each other away." As the night wore on, Elizabeth's condition began to show signs of improvement. Her fever broke just after midnight, leaving her weak but coherent for the first time in days. When she opened her eyes and saw Sarah sitting beside her, tears of relief rolled down both women's faces. "Where are we?" Elizabeth whispered weakly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Sarah quickly explained their situation, describing the fire, their rescue by Red Hawk, and their current sanctuary in the Lakota village. Elizabeth listened with growing amazement, her eyes widening as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings and the gentle ministrations of the medicine woman who continued to tend to her needs. "They saved our lives," Elizabeth murmured, struggling to sit up so she could properly acknowledge Winona's care. "How can we ever repay such kindness?" This question would prove more complicated than either woman initially realized. Over the following days, as Elizabeth slowly regained her strength under Winona's careful treatment, it became clear that returning to their previous life would be impossible. Their homestead was completely destroyed, their livestock was dead, and they had no resources to rebuild. Even if Thomas Mitchell returned as scheduled, he would find nothing but ash and ruins where his family home had once stood. Red Hawk spent considerable time discussing their situation with his grandmother and the other village elders. The question of what to do with the two white women had no easy answers. Simply turning them out onto the prairie would be a death sentence, but keeping them in the village indefinitely could create problems with both the U.S. Army and hostile Native American groups who viewed any cooperation with whites as betrayal. During her recovery, Sarah began to learn more about the daily life of the village. She watched the women's work with fascination, observing how they prepared food, crafted clothing and tools, and cared for their children. Despite the language barrier, she found ways to help with simple tasks, earning gradual acceptance from the community members who initially viewed her with suspicion. The children were her easiest conquest. Her fair hair and pale skin made her an object of endless fascination, and she soon found herself surrounded by curious youngsters whenever she ventured outside the medicine lodge. She began teaching them simple English words while attempting to learn basic Lakota phrases in return, creating an informal language exchange that delighted everyone involved. One morning, about a week after their arrival, Red Hawk approached Sarah with news that changed everything. He had been out on a scouting expedition and had encountered a cavalry patrol searching for survivors of the Prairie fire. Among the soldiers was Thomas Mitchell, who had returned early from his trading expedition upon hearing news of the devastating blaze that had swept through his area. "Your father searches for you," Red Hawk told Sarah. "He has been riding for 3 days, looking through the burned areas for any sign of survivors. The soldiers say he refuses to believe you are dead." Sarah's heart leaped with joy at the news that her father was alive and looking for them. But as she looked around the village that had become their temporary home, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. These people had saved their lives when they had every reason to turn away or even view them as enemies. Winona had devoted days to nursing her mother back to health, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of preserving life. "Will you take us to him?" Sarah asked, though part of her dreaded leaving the safety and warmth of the village. Red Hawk nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Yes, but there may be problems. The soldiers, they do not always understand why a white family would be in a Lakota village. They may think you were taken against your will or that my people were involved in some wrongdoing." This concern proved to be well-founded. When Red Hawk led Sarah and Elizabeth to the meeting point where Thomas Mitchell waited with the cavalry patrol, the reunion was initially joyful, but quickly became tense. Thomas embraced his wife and daughter with tears of relief, but the soldiers viewed the Lakota warrior with immediate suspicion. "Step away from those women, Indian," commanded the patrol's lieutenant. his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "We'll be asking them some questions about how they came to be in your custody." Sarah immediately stepped forward, placing herself between Red Hawk and the hostile soldiers. "This man saved our lives," she declared firmly. "He and his grandmother cared for us when we would have died in the burned prairie. You will treat him with the respect he deserves." The confrontation that followed would test not only Sarah's courage but also her ability to bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed determined to view each other as enemies. The decisions made in the next few minutes would have consequences that would echo through the rest of her life, forcing her to choose between the safety of her own people and the debt of gratitude she owed to those who had shown her compassion when she needed it most, as tension crackled in the air between the nervous soldiers and the proud Lakota warrior. Sarah realized that her real ordeal was just beginning. Surviving the prairie fire had been only the first challenge. Now she faced the much more complex task of navigating the treacherous waters of racial prejudice and cultural misunderstanding that threatened to destroy the fragile bonds of trust and friendship that had developed during her time in the village. The standoff between the cavalry patrol and Red Hawk created a tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present like an approaching thunderstorm. Lieutenant Harrison, a young officer with nervous eyes and an obvious lack of experience dealing with Native Americans, kept his hand near his weapon while trying to maintain an authoritative stance that fooled no one. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from that Indian and tell me exactly what happened here," he ordered Sarah, his voice carrying the tremor of someone trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Did this man or his people threaten you or your mother in any way?" Sarah felt her temper flare at the implication behind the question. After everything Red Hawk and his grandmother had done for them, to have their kindness repaid with suspicion and barely concealed hostility was more than she could bear. "The only threat my mother and I faced was death from exposure and fever," she replied sharply, her voice carrying across the burned prairie with surprising authority. "This man risked his own safety to help complete strangers. He carried my dying mother to his village where his grandmother used her medicine to save her life. If you're looking for someone to arrest, Lieutenant, perhaps you should start with your own conscience for assuming the worst about people who showed us nothing but kindness." Thomas Mitchell, who had been silently observing the exchange while holding his wife's hand, stepped forward to support his daughter's account. "Sarah's right, Lieutenant. Look at my wife. She was near death when we lost her in the fire. Now she's standing here alive and well. That didn't happen by accident." Elizabeth, though still weak from her ordeal, managed to find her voice as well. "The medicine woman, Winona, she sat by my bedside for days and nights, giving me herbs and keeping the fever down. She asked for nothing in return except the chance to practice her healing arts. I owe that woman my life." Lieutenant Harrison looked uncomfortable as he realized that his assumptions about the situation were not being supported by the supposed victims. The other soldiers in his patrol began to shift nervously, uncertain about how to proceed when the people they had come to rescue were defending their supposed captors. Red Hawk, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up in his careful English. "Lieutenant, I have worked as scout for your army many times. Colonel Morrison at Fort Laramie knows me. I am not enemy to white people, though I have reason to be cautious around soldiers who see war paint where there is only kindness." The mention of Colonel Morrison caused Lieutenant Harrison to pause. The colonel was well known throughout the territory as a fair man who had worked hard to maintain peaceful relations with the local tribes. If this Indian was telling the truth about his service record, then arresting him could create serious problems with the fort's command structure. "Even if what you're saying is true," the lieutenant said slowly, clearly trying to find a way out of the difficult situation, "I have orders to escort any survivors back to the nearest settlement for medical attention and debriefing. You people need to come with us now." Sarah looked back toward the direction of the Lakota village, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was about to leave behind people who had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The thought of never seeing Winona again, of being unable to properly thank the woman who had saved her mother's life, felt like abandoning family. "I want to go back to the village first," she announced, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness of her declaration. "We need to say goodbye properly and thank the people who helped us." "It's only right." Lieutenant Harrison shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. I'm not taking a patrol of U.S. soldiers into an Indian camp. That's asking for trouble." "Then I'll go alone," Sarah replied without hesitation. Red Hawk can escort me back to say goodbye, and then we'll meet you at whatever settlement you think is appropriate. Sarah, no, her father interjected, fear evident in his voice. You've been through enough. We need to get you and your mother to safety. But Elizabeth Mitchell surprised everyone by supporting her daughter's request. Thomas, these people saved our lives. The least we can do is thank them properly before we leave. It's a matter of common decency. The argument that followed revealed deep divisions not just between the whites and the Native American, but among the whites themselves. Thomas Mitchell was torn between his gratitude to Red Hawk and his desire to get his family to safety as quickly as possible. Lieutenant Harrison was caught between his orders and his growing realization that the situation was far more complex than he had been led to believe. Finally, Red Hawk offered a compromise that satisfied everyone's concerns. There is a trading post 1 day's ride from here, he said. The owner, John Baptiste. He is friend to both white and Lakota people. Your family can stay there safely while I bring Winona and others from the village to meet with you. This way you can give proper thanks without soldiers entering our camp. The suggestion made sense to everyone involved. Jean-Baptiste's trading post was well known throughout the territory as a neutral ground where people of different backgrounds could meet and conduct business without the tensions that plagued other interactions between whites and Native Americans. Lieutenant Harrison agreed to escort the Mitchell family there, while Red Hawk would return to his village to arrange the meeting. The journey to the trading post took them across more of the burned prairie, providing a sobering reminder of the devastation the fire had caused. They passed the remains of several other homesteads, some of which showed evidence that their owners had not been as fortunate as the Mitchell family. Sarah found herself wondering about the families who had lived in those destroyed homes, and whether any other survivors had been found. Jean-Baptiste's trading post was an oasis of civilization in the middle of the vast prairie. The main building was constructed of logs and stone, built to withstand both prairie fires and harsh weather. Surrounding it were several smaller structures, including a stable, a storage building, and living quarters for the trader and his Native American wife. Baptiste himself was a grizzled French-Canadian in his 50s who had spent most of his adult life on the frontier. He greeted the Mitchell family with genuine warmth and quickly arranged comfortable accommodations for them while they waited for the promised meeting with Red Hawk's people. Red Hawk is good man, Baptiste assured them as he served them their first hot meal in over a week. His grandmother, Winona, she has helped many people over the years. You were lucky to find them instead of some of the war parties that have been moving through this area lately. The trader's words provided context that helped Sarah understand just how fortunate they had been. Not all Native Americans in the territory were as peaceful as Red Hawk's village, and there had been increasing tensions between various tribes and the expanding white settlements. The fact that they had encountered someone willing to help rather than harm them was indeed a stroke of incredible luck. 2 days later, Red Hawk returned with a small group from his village, including Winona and several other individuals who had helped care for Elizabeth during her recovery. The reunion was emotional, with tears flowing freely as the Mitchell family attempted to express their gratitude for the kindness they had received. Winona spoke at length with Elizabeth, checking on her recovery and providing additional herbs and medicines for her continued healing. Through Red Hawk's translation, she also shared traditional Lakota prayers and blessings for the family's future welfare. But it was Sarah's conversation with Red Hawk that proved most significant. As they walked together around the trading post, he spoke about the challenges facing his people and the uncertain future that lay ahead for everyone living on the frontier. The world is changing very fast, he told her. More white people come every year, and the old ways of living become harder to maintain. Sometimes, I think there will be great trouble ahead for all of us. Sarah found herself deeply moved by his words and by the perspective they offered on the complex situation developing across the Western Territories. For the first time, she began to understand that the conflicts between whites and Native Americans were not simply matters of good versus evil, but rather the inevitable result of two very different ways of life being forced to coexist in the same space. What will happen to your village? She asked, genuinely concerned about the people who had shown her such kindness. Red Hawk's expression grew serious as he considered the question. We will try to find ways to live in peace with the changes that come. But peace requires understanding from both sides, and understanding is often the first casualty when people are afraid. His words would prove prophetic in ways that Sarah could not yet imagine. The peaceful interlude at the trading post was about to be shattered by events that would test not only her courage and loyalty, but also her ability to choose between the world she had always known and the broader understanding of humanity that her experience with Red Hawk's people had given her. The peaceful atmosphere at John Baptiste's trading post was shattered on the third morning when a larger cavalry unit arrived with disturbing news. Captain Williams, a stern career soldier with gray at his temples and hard lines around his eyes, brought word that tensions in the territory had escalated dramatically while the Mitchell family had been isolated in their struggle for survival. "There's been raids on 2 settlements north of here," Captain Williams informed Lieutenant Harrison as Sarah listened from nearby. 3 families killed, livestock stolen, buildings burned. The territorial governor has declared martial law and ordered all Indians to report to designated reservations immediately. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she heard these words. She looked toward where Red Hawk and his companions were preparing to return to their village, unaware of the dangerous new developments that threatened to engulf them all. "Captain," Lieutenant Harrison said carefully, "the Indians here aren't hostile. They've been helping survivors from the Prairie fire. These people saved the lives of civilians." Captain Williams turned his hard gaze toward the small group of Lakota who had come to the trading post in peace. "I don't care if they're feeding orphans and singing hymns, Lieutenant. My orders are clear. All Indians found outside designated areas are to be arrested and transported to Fort Laramie for processing." The injustice of the situation struck Sarah like a physical blow. She watched as soldiers began to surround Red Hawk and his companions, men who had shown nothing but kindness being treated like criminals because of the actions of others who happened to share their heritage. "This is wrong," she said loudly, stepping forward despite her father's restraining hand on her arm. "These people are innocent. They saved our lives." Captain Williams looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Miss, I understand you may feel grateful to these Indians, but you don't understand the bigger picture here. We're dealing with a coordinated uprising that threatens every white settlement in the territory. I can't make exceptions based on individual acts of kindness." But Sarah had lived through too much in recent days to be intimidated by military authority. The fire had burned away more than just her family's possessions. It had also destroyed many of her previous assumptions about the world and the people in it. "Captain Williams, these people risked their own safety to help strangers who had every reason to be their enemies," she said firmly. "If we repay that kindness with imprisonment, what does that say about our own character?" Red Hawk, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of the danger his people faced, stepped forward with his hands clearly visible and empty. "Captain, I have served as scout for the Army. I know Colonel Morrison at Fort Laramie. Perhaps you could send word to him before you decide what to do with us." The mention of Colonel Morrison caused Captain Williams to pause, just as it had with Lieutenant Harrison several days earlier. The colonel's reputation for fairness and his success in maintaining peaceful relations with several tribal groups made him someone whose opinions carried weight, even with hardline military officers. "You say you've worked with Morrison?" Williams asked, his tone slightly less hostile. "Many times," Red Hawk confirmed. "I have helped guide supply trains, tracked hostile war parties, and carried messages between the fort and peaceful villages. Colonel Morrison will vouch for my character and for my grandmother's village." Jean Baptiste, who had been quietly observing the confrontation from his porch, finally decided to intervene. As a respected trader who maintained relationships with both the military and various Native American groups, his word carried considerable weight in such situations. "Captain, I've known Red Hawk and his people for more than 10 years, Baptiste said, approaching the group with his characteristic diplomatic manner. "They've never been involved in any raids or hostile actions. In fact, they've helped me track down stolen goods and return them to their rightful owners on several occasions." The tension in the air was palpable as Captain Williams weighed his options. His orders were clear, but the circumstances were more complex than his superiors had anticipated when those orders were issued. Arresting peaceful Indians who had demonstrably helped white civilians could create political problems that would reach all the way to the territorial capital. Elizabeth Mitchell, who had been strengthened by her days of recovery under Winona's care, chose this moment to add her voice to the growing chorus of support for Red Hawk's people. "Captain, I'm a dying woman saved by Lakota medicine," she said. her voice carrying the authority that comes from having looked death in the face and survived. "If you arrest the people who saved my life, you'll have to answer to God for punishing mercy with cruelty." Her words seemed to strike home with several of the younger soldiers, who began to look uncomfortable with their role in the proceedings. Sarah realized that this might be their best chance to prevent a tragedy that would dishonor everyone involved. "Captain Williams," she said, stepping closer to the officer, "what if Red Hawk and his people agreed to escort us to Fort Laramie voluntarily? They could speak with Colonel Morrison directly, and you could fulfill your orders to bring them in without making it look like they're criminals." It was a compromise that offered something to everyone involved. Captain Williams could report that he had successfully detained the Indians as ordered, while Red Hawk and his people would have the opportunity to plead their case to someone who knew their history and character. After several tense minutes of consideration, Captain Williams nodded slowly. "All right, we'll do it that way. But I want it understood that these Indians are in military custody during the entire journey. Any attempt to escape will be met with appropriate force." Red Hawk agreed to the terms, though Sarah could see the pain in his eyes at being treated as a prisoner after everything he had done to help her family. As the group prepared for the journey to Fort Laramie, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm going with them," she announced to her parents. "I need to make sure Colonel Morrison understands exactly what these people did for us." Thomas Mitchell was aghast at his daughter's proposal. "Sarah, you've been through enough. Let the Army handle this situation." But Sarah had discovered something about herself during the ordeal of the fire and its aftermath. She had found reserves of courage and determination that she never knew she possessed, and she couldn't stand by and watch injustice triumph over compassion. "Father, if I don't speak up for these people, who will?" she asked. "They saved Mother's life. They saved both our lives. I won't abandon them now when they need help." The journey to Fort Laramie took 3 days, during which Sarah rode alongside the small group of Lakota prisoners, learning more about their culture and their fears for the future. Winona, despite her advanced age, maintained a dignity and grace that impressed even the hardened soldiers assigned to guard them. Through Red Hawk's translation, the medicine woman shared stories of her youth, when the prairie had been an endless sea of grass where buffalo roamed in vast herds and different tribes moved freely across the landscape, according to the seasons. She spoke of a time when conflicts between groups were settled through negotiation and ritual rather than wholesale warfare, and when the arrival of white settlers had seemed like just another change to be accommodated, rather than a threat to their entire way of life. She says the fire that burned your home was like the fire that now burns through the hearts of men. Red Hawk translated as Winona spoke softly around their evening campfire. Both fires destroy much, but from the ashes, new things can grow if people have wisdom and patience. As they approached Fort Laramie, Sarah felt a growing sense of urgency about the confrontation that lay ahead. Colonel Morrison's decision about Red Hawk and his people would set a precedent that could affect the treatment of peaceful Native Americans throughout the territory. If he chose to follow the strict letter of his orders and send them to a reservation, regardless of their individual circumstances, it would send a message that good deeds and peaceful intentions counted for nothing in the face of military expediency. But if he chose to recognize their service and allow them to return to their village, with some form of official protection, it might offer hope for a different kind of relationship between the two peoples who were struggling to share the vast prairie landscape. The fort appeared on the horizon like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness, its wooden walls and military buildings representing the advancing edge of American expansion into the Western territories. But for Sarah, who had learned to see the world through different eyes during her time with Red Hawk's people, it also represented the challenge of bridging two very different cultures in a way that honored the best in both while avoiding the tragic conflicts that seemed to be engulfing the frontier. As they rode through the fort's gates, Sarah said a silent prayer that wisdom and justice would prevail over fear and prejudice in the crucial decisions that lay ahead. The fate of Red Hawk and his people hung in the balance, and with it, perhaps, the possibility of a more peaceful future for everyone trying to build new lives on the American frontier. Fort Laramie bustled with activity as their small convoy entered the main compound. Sarah had never seen so many soldiers in one place, and the atmosphere was tense with the urgency of military preparations. Supply wagons rolled through the gates while messengers rode out carrying dispatches to distant outposts. The recent raids had clearly put the entire territorial command on high alert. Colonel Morrison emerged from his headquarters building as Captain Williams approached to make his report. Sarah studied the colonel carefully, trying to read his character in his weathered features and steady gray eyes. She had heard Red Hawk speak of him with respect, but now she would discover whether that respect was justified. "Colonel Morrison." "Sir," Captain Williams began formally. "I've brought in a group of Indians found outside designated areas, along with some civilians they claim to have assisted during the recent Prairie fire." The colonel's eyes immediately found Red Hawk among the group, and Sarah was relieved to see recognition and what appeared to be genuine warmth in his expression. "Red Hawk," Colonel Morrison said, stepping forward to greet the Lakota scout. "I heard about the fire in your sector. I was hoping you and your people had survived it safely." "We did survive, Colonel," Red Hawk replied, his posture relaxing slightly in the presence of someone he trusted, "and we were able to help others survive as well." Sarah seized the opportunity to speak before Captain Williams could present his version of events. "Colonel Morrison, this man and his grandmother saved my mother's life. My family owes them everything." The colonel turned his attention to Sarah, taking in her earnest expression and the obvious conviction in her voice. "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell, sir. My family's homestead was destroyed in the fire, and my mother was dying of fever and smoke inhalation. Red Hawk found us and brought us to his village, where his grandmother used her medicine to nurse my mother back to health. Without their help, we would both be dead." Colonel Morrison listened intently as Sarah recounted the full story of their rescue and the days spent recovering in the Lakota village. She made sure to emphasize not only the medical care they had received, but also the kindness and respect with which they had been treated by people who had every historical reason to view them as enemies. "These people asked for nothing in return for their help," Sarah concluded. "They simply saw fellow human beings in desperate need and acted according to their own principles of compassion and honor." Captain Williams shifted uncomfortably as Sarah's account made his decision to arrest the Indians appear increasingly questionable. "Sir, regardless of individual circumstances, my orders were clear. All Indians found outside designated areas were to be brought in for processing." Colonel Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Captain, I understand your position. These are difficult times, and we must take precautions to protect our civilian population." He paused, studying the small group of Lakota who stood quietly under military guard. "However, we must also be careful not to punish those who have proven themselves to be allies and friends." Winona, who had remained silent during most of the proceedings, spoke up in her careful English. "Colonel Morrison, I am an old woman who has seen many changes come to the Prairie. I have always taught my people that the path of peace is harder, but better than the path of war. What message do you send to those who choose peace if you treat them the same as those who choose war?" Her words carried a dignity and wisdom that seemed to resonate even with the hardened soldiers who surrounded them. Colonel Morrison approached the elderly medicine woman and spoke to her with obvious respect. "Winona, I remember when you helped treat our wounded after the skirmish at Crow Creek 3 years ago. You could have turned your back on injured soldiers, but you chose to heal rather than let men suffer." "All people deserve healing when they are hurt," Winona replied simply. "The color of their skin does not change the color of their blood." Colonel Morrison was quiet for several minutes as he considered the situation. Sarah could see him weighing his military obligations against his personal knowledge of Red Hawk and his people. Finally, he turned to address the assembled group. "Red Hawk, I'm going to offer you and your people a choice," he said. "You can accept relocation to the Pine Ridge Reservation, with government protection and support. Or you can return to your village with my written guarantee of safe passage and official recognition as friends of the United States military." The offer was more generous than anyone had dared hope for, but it came with significant implications. Accepting relocation meant safety, but also the end of their traditional way of life. Returning to their village meant freedom, but also continued exposure to the growing tensions between whites and Native Americans throughout the territory. Red Hawk spoke quietly with his companions in Lakota before responding. "Colonel, we are grateful for your offer of protection, but our village has been our home for many generations. The spirits of our ancestors rest in that soil, and we cannot abandon them unless we have no other choice." "I understand," Colonel Morrison replied. "In that case, I'll provide you with official documentation that identifies you as allies of the United States government. This should offer some protection against other military units who might not know your history. But even as he spoke these words, Sarah could see the concern in the colonel's eyes. The documents he could provide would offer some protection, but they could not guarantee safety in a territory where fear and prejudice were increasingly driving policy decisions. As Red Hawk and his people prepared to return to their village, Sarah faced her own difficult decision. Her parents expected her to return with them to rebuild their lives in the relative safety of an established settlement. But her experiences of the past weeks had changed her in fundamental ways that she was only beginning to understand. "I want to go with them," she announced suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "Sarah, no," her father protested immediately. "You belong with your family." But Elizabeth Mitchell, whose life had been saved by Lakota medicine, stepped forward to support her daughter's decision. "Thomas, our daughter has found something important with these people. Perhaps we should trust her judgment." "What exactly are you proposing?" Colonel Morrison asked Sarah directly. "I want to serve as a liaison between Red Hawk's village and the fort," Sarah replied, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "Someone who can help prevent misunderstandings and ensure that communication remains open between your people and theirs." It was an unusual proposal, but not without precedent. The Army had occasionally employed civilian interpreters and mediators to help maintain peaceful relations with friendly tribes. Sarah's first-hand experience of Lakota hospitality and her obvious commitment to justice made her a potentially valuable bridge between the two cultures. Red Hawk looked surprised but pleased by Sarah's offer. "You would be welcome in our village," he said. "My grandmother has said that you have the heart of a peacemaker." Colonel Morrison considered the proposal carefully. "Miss Mitchell, such a position would involve considerable risks. The situation in this territory is becoming more volatile by the day." "Colonel, I've already faced fire and near death," Sarah replied. "I'm not afraid of taking risks for something I believe in." After further discussion, an arrangement was reached that satisfied everyone's concerns. Sarah would spend part of her time at the fort, where she could report on conditions in Red Hawk's village and serve as an advocate for peaceful Native Americans who might need military protection. The rest of her time would be spent in the village itself, where she could continue learning about Lakota culture while serving as a communication link with the outside world. Her parents were reluctant to see her take on such responsibilities, but they had come to understand that their daughter had been transformed by her experiences in ways that would make a return to her previous life impossible. The Prairie fire had destroyed more than their material possessions. It had also burned away the narrow assumptions and prejudices that had previously limited Sarah's vision of what was possible in the world. As the group prepared to leave Fort Laramie, Sarah took one last look at the military compound that represented the advancing edge of American civilization. Tomorrow she would return to the Lakota village that had become her second home, carrying with her the hope that understanding and cooperation might triumph over fear and conflict. The Prairie fire that had seemed like such a devastating catastrophe just weeks earlier had ultimately become the catalyst for a transformation that extended far beyond the burned grassland. Sarah had lost her sight of the narrow world she had once known, but she had gained a vision of a larger and more inclusive future where people of different backgrounds could find ways to live together in peace. As they rode away from the fort into the vast expanse of the prairie, now beginning to show the first green shoots of grass growing up through the ashes of the fire, Sarah reflected on the strange ways that destruction could sometimes clear the ground for new growth. The landscape around them bore the scars of the fire that had changed their lives, but it was already beginning the slow process of renewal that would eventually restore its beauty and abundance. Perhaps, Sarah thought as she watched Red Hawk riding beside her with quiet dignity, the same process of renewal was possible for the relationships between the peoples who shared this vast and beautiful land. It would require patience, understanding, and the courage to see beyond the prejudices that had kept them apart. But if it was possible for new grass to grow from burned earth, perhaps it was also possible for new forms of respect and cooperation to grow from the ashes of old conflicts. The future stretched ahead of them as wide and full of possibilities as the prairie itself, and Sarah faced it with hope rather than fear, confident that she had found her place in the world and her purpose in helping to build a better tomorrow for everyone who called the frontier home.